Our webinar topic today is AI in the workplace, rethinking skill development. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Arvind Karunakaran. Arvind is an assistant professor at Stanford University in the Department of Management Science and Engineering. He is a core faculty member of the Center for Work, Technology, and Organization, Stanford Technology Ventures Program, and a faculty affiliate of the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence and the Digital Economy Lab. His research draws on organizational theory and the sociology of work, examining authority and accountability in the workplace, especially in the context of technological change. Arvind also teaches in the Stanford Online Digital Transformation Program. He teaches a course called XDGT 130, Change Management, Reskilling in the Age of Analytics and AI. Arvind, welcome, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Heidi, and thank you everybody for joining. Super excited to get this webinar started. So as Heidi mentioned, my name is Arvind Karunakaran. I'm a faculty here at Stanford. Prior to joining, I did my PhD at MIT Sloan. I worked in the tech industry before that for a number of years in several different roles. Broadly, my research focuses on how technology, especially emerging technologies such as AI, impacts the structure of work. How does that impact especially skills and skill development, and more broader implications for organization and strategy? So that's what we're going to talk about today, zooming on one specific topic, especially with respect to AI and Gen AI, and how is that impacting skills, and what could we as individuals, but also as managers supervising many people, on how could we facilitate skill development, right? So that's going to be the overall focus. As Heidi mentioned, please use the Q&A box. If you have any questions throughout, we will also handle questions at the end of the presentation. But if you have any questions in between, please feel free to share them. But let me get started with some kind of a warm-up activity. And please, again, use the Q&A box to put your responses for this question. So the warm-up question I'm going to ask is the following, right? Of course, there have been many types of technologies the past 2 decades, especially introduced into the workplace. You could think about analytics, you could think about ERP systems and CRM systems and so forth, right? So the question I wanted to ask is there anything at all unique that you think about AI, and specifically generative AI, like ChaptGPT and Dall-E and platforms like that, as compared to the other types of technologies that you have been exposed to, like all the way from your ERP, CRM systems to something like Zoom, remote work platforms? So could you think of any something that is particularly unique about Gen AI? Please, again, use the Q&A box or to put in your responses, or just think for yourself on, is there something fundamentally unique about Gen AI, right? So let's take maybe 30 seconds to think through something that is particularly unique. Thanks for you. That's interesting. Yes. But something that is particularly unique, right? As compared to, say, analytics, as compared to other types of technologies you have been exposed to. Speed of change, for sure. Multi-usage, unlimited possibilities, yes. Yeah, there's also questions about dependability, yeah. Speed of delivery of information, for sure, yeah. Can create content versus being fed data, that's important. But I would urge you to think about if there's something that is particularly unique, right? That most of the technologies could not quite replicate. Not just in terms of what it is capable of, but also in terms of, something that is even more deeper. Yeah, vertical specific use cases. Yeah, we're getting a lot of very interesting responses, right? Like all of them super insightful. But from my perspective, what is particularly unique about Gen AI as compared to other types of technologies that we have seen in the past 2 decades is the following. Like other technologies, as I mentioned, your like remote work tools like Zoom or your enterprise resource planning or CRM systems, they have all of these technologies have features and functionalities, right? There's some set of pre-built features and functionalities that you could train your employees and your managers on how to use those features and functionalities, right? You could have training programs, the vendors could provide videos, you could watch them, you could actually use those technologies and learn what those features and functionalities are. But if you think about generative AI specifically, it's not that there are some pre-built features and functionalities per se, right? I mean, apart from your ability to type in prompts, and there are no specific pre-built features functionalities. Instead, these functionalities gets discovered as people use it as a part of their everyday work, right? I mean, if you think about have you used ChaptGPT or any of these Gen AI, LLM technologies? It's not that they come in with, okay, you could use it for XYZ. Only when you use it and experiment as a part of your everyday work, you discover what it is good for, what it is not really great for. And in the process, you try to adapt and embed the technology as a part of your everyday work, right? So that's, in my mind, something that is particularly unique with respect to Gen AI as opposed to other technologies. No pre-built features, functionalities per se. It gets discovered as people use and experiment as a part of their everyday work in a very trial and error basis, right? So that has a lot of implications if you think about the topic for today about skills and skill development, right? The broader issue is the following. If the value of Gen AI gets discovered only when people use it and experiment in a trial and error fashion, discover what it is good for, not good for, then that means that people should indeed, they need to experiment on an everyday basis. But why would they experiment if you're an employee of a company? Why would you experiment if you don't really see a value in it, or if you see that the technology itself could be a threat for your own job, your expertise in the long run, right? Or if you see that there are a lot of issues, some of you mentioned about hallucinations, right? So therefore, it is non-obvious that people would experiment and use the technology on an everyday basis. And because there are no pre-built features and functionalities, it's also very difficult for organizations, if you're a manager, to train your workforce, to your employees, to use these technologies. You can't force them. You can have some training programs on how to use prompts better, different types of prompting tactics and strategies. But beyond that, it is actually up to the people on the ground to discover, right? So that's one issue that we have been trying to grapple with. A lot of organizations are investing money to get like an enterprise-wide license for different types of Gen AI technologies, from ChatGPT to Dall-E and many other platforms. But there have been issues with respect to adoption and use. People, either they're not using it regularly, or even if they're using it, it is not facilitating what we call a culture of experimentation and knowledge sharing among people, right? They are not trying to explore the different possibilities of Gen AI, which in turn has some downstream impact, which I'll talk about. So that's one. The second important thing is, how do you go about embedding AI as a part of people's everyday work? This, again, cannot really be a very much of a top-down enforced process. It needs to be an emergent bottom-up process as people discover what the technology is good for their work, to accomplish their work. So that's the second thing that we will briefly touch on, and the implications it has for skills. And finally, like if you're a manager, the question people ask is, okay, we have invested so much in this technology, what is the ROI, right? Typically, that leads to a lot of issues around measurement. And my argument here is that we are actually trying to measure the wrong things in terms of productivity gains, as opposed to trying to measure other important things such as skills and skill development. And we will talk about some of those issues too as a part of the webinar. So that's the first category of issues to consider: adoption and usage, specifically how to facilitate a culture of experimentation so that people actually learn to use the technology, but also develop new skills in the process, right? So that's the key takeaway. The second is, how do you structure these initiatives? If you're not just an employee, but if you're managing a set of people, how do you go about structuring these initiatives, right? Should you have like a center of excellence? Should you do it in a very decentralized manner? Or should you sort of centralize it, have best practices? It's actually non-obvious if you think about it, because there are different trade-offs in each of these choices. And we'll talk about that too. And finally, the last issue to consider, like I briefly touched upon, is on skill development and productivity. All right. There are two issues to consider here. One is a lot of places, individual employees are experimenting with Gen AI, right? If you're a graphic designer, if you're a programmer using Copilot or any one of these technologies, people are using it. But again, there is very less incentive for them to report that they are using it, right? You could basically be a lot more productive. But then you don't need to report that you're being that productive. You could do other things. You could take on a second job, right? Or you could just like chill out and watch Netflix when you're working, right? So that's another issue. Like, how do we capture the individual gains in productivity at the organizational level? What other types of incentives, other types of programs should put in place so that actually people share that they're using Gen AI, and there is some form of cumulative knowledge across the organization that gets shared. So that's one issue. This leakage from individual to organizational productivity, how do we manage that? That's one issue. But the more substantive issue is people, especially managers, tend to conflate gains in productivity to gains in skills, right? Just because you're more productive doing the same task much faster does not necessarily mean that you're learning or gaining new skills. In fact, you might lose skills, right? You're over dependent on this technology. You lose skills, or like you're not learning anything new. And in the long run, you get left out in the process as an individual. So we will talk about that conundrum too. So how do you facilitate skill development at an individual employee level, where you're doing more complex tasks, not just the same task, much more faster? And in the process, you're also more productive, right? The productivity gain is almost like a byproduct because you're gaining new skills in the process, not the vice versa. So these are the things that we're going to talk about today. How do you make sure that employees are gaining new skills in the process, performing more complex tasks, as opposed to just doing the same task much faster, which over time actually makes them lose skills? So how do we avoid those traps? So these are the things that we're going to talk about, mainly focused on angle around skills and organizational change, right? Okay, so let's get started. If you're actually interested in this topic on skills and skill development, there's a very good book, recent book that just came out by Matt Bean called The Skill Code, where he goes in a lot of depth talking about this like trade-off between productivity and skills, and how do you make sure employees learn new skills in the process. So I would highly recommend, if you're interested in this topic, to learn more. Okay, so the angle that we're going to deal with on skill development is a simple framework that we have developed, what we call a three lenses framework. And as the name suggests, the lens is like way of looking at the world, right? It's not that one lens is like right or this is wrong or better. It's just different ways of looking at the world. So the three lenses are what we call, the first lens is a strategic design lens. The second lens is a power and political lens. And the third lens is a cultural lens. And each lens has some basic assumptions and basic sort of strategies. But it has implications both for change at the organizational level, but also change at the individual level in terms of skills and learning new skills. So let me briefly walk through that. And then I will actually give some concrete examples based on actual Gen AI use in a company, and what type of challenges they face with respect to skill development in their employees. And then we will wrap it up after that, right? So that's going to be the plan for the rest of the webinar. So let me walk through briefly about the three lenses framework, right? The first lens is called the strategic design lens. So from this lens, the assumption is that organizations are like machines. It's an information processing machine. So therefore, you have to optimize an organization properly so that information flows better between different parts, and people are able to basically understand the dependencies across different parts of the machine, right? So things such as how do you structure AI initiatives? Should you keep it centralized, decentralized, have more of a network of excellence model? All of that would fall under this lens, right? The various trade-offs involved. So that's the first lens. This and it has implications again for how organizations change, but also how, as individuals, we could develop skills, right? The second lens is the power and political lens. And this lens is, according to this lens, the assumption is that organizations are like contests, right? Like people are contesting for resources, for power and status, and many other things. It's not just like a information processing machine. It is actually a status contest, a contest for resources. So therefore, here issues around jurisdiction and turf becomes all the more important. And when I get to the case, these issues will become a lot more clear, right? With respect to AI and skill development, the way people will develop skills through using AI is not just learning more about the technology itself, more about ChatGPT, but also using the technology to do more complex tasks and complex types of activities, right? But if you think about it in an actual organizational context, if you do more complex tasks, oftentimes or not, then not you're stepping into someone else's shoes, right? Someone else who's already doing that complex work. So how do you manage those dynamics, those power political dynamics, issues around jurisdiction and turf wars, which again has a lot of implication for skills and skill development. We'll talk about that too. And finally, the cultural lens. According to this lens, organizations are viewed as institutions, right? A lot about meaning and the type of practices, the informal norms, particular organization or even a division within an organization shares, which in turn facilitates certain types of climate inside that division or inside that organization, which in turn allows people to experiment more. There's a lot more tolerance for failure versus a lot more strict about, not making mistakes, right? So all of these again matter with respect to using Gen AI to learn new skills. So that's the three lenses framework we're going to use. But to make this a lot more concrete, we got to actually look at a real case study of a company using Gen AI. Over the past 2 years, this company adopted generative AI. This is a corporate law firm that does like patent and IP law. They adopted this technology even before ChatGPT was released. This was a very vertical specific large language model for the legal industry, right? Mainly used by paralegals. So I will use this case to walk through what we found and some of the trade-offs in the different lenses that I talked about, some of the with respect to skill development and stuff like that. And then we'll have some broader takeaways from this case. What does it mean for you, either as an individual employee or as like a manager managing others, with respect to how do you develop skills, how do you reskill your workforce in the wake of AI, right? So let's jump in. So the first choice, this organization, as I mentioned, it's a corporate law firm that does patent IP-related law. The first choice this organization faced was they realized, the founders, the partners realized that AI is coming, Gen AI is coming to disrupt their industry. And especially so because if you know anything about corporate law firms, they are a very text-heavy industry. They generate a lot of documents and text and contracts and non-disclosure agreements. They write complex contracts for their clients. Bulk of what they do is around that, right? So they know that Gen AI and large language models are coming. So they were ahead of time adopting this vertical specific LLM for legal services, right? So the choice they faced was how do we go about implementing and introducing this initiative? Different trade-offs, right? From a strategic design perspective, they could have a more centralized functional model where they have some kind of an analytics and AI group that is in charge of this initiative, in charge of adopting this technology and scaling it up across the organization. Or they could do a more decentralized model. Each business unit or each division within the law firm could go about implementing AI and associated technologies. That's the second choice, where the divisional managers have a lot more leeway. And finally, they could have a more of a consulting model where they could bring in either outside experts or some kind of a specialized group focused on Gen AI, right? They would be in charge of finding out what the best practices are in implementing them, training the workforce, training the attorneys and the paralegals who work for this organization. Different trade-offs in each of the model, as you could think about, right? The functional model, you will have best practices. It's a little bit more to have consistent practices across the organization, but you really don't know what is the best use case for one particular division versus others. You really don't know what exactly one type of paralegal would use the technology for as compared to another type of paralegal, right? So trade-offs there. The decentralized model have other types of trade-offs involved. Here, you will not have uniformity. You might not even have consistency on how the technology is used, but there is a lot more discretion at the division level, right? They can decide how to roll this technology, what type of incentives to set, and so forth, right? So trade-offs in each of this. But this organization decided that given each business unit is pretty have different sets of demands, they decided to go for a decentralized model. In other words, each division manager would have discretion on how to go about introducing this technology called the LawBot, again, a large language model trained on the legal services industry. So it's a very decentralized model. The division managers have a lot of like a leeway, right? So that's the starting point. Uh, what happened afterwards? Once they decided that we will allow the division managers to implement, roll out Gen AI, and make sure that people are trained on how to use the technology and so forth. So what we observed, we basically followed two divisions. Let's call them Division A and B at this company, a legal course, a pseudonym. And we tracked them for many years, a couple of years, on how the technology is getting used. And these divisions are pretty similar in a lot of dimensions. They did similar types of patent law. The paralegals were trained similarly. The backgrounds were quite similar. What we found was the following. Again, I remember the earlier I mentioned about the importance of ongoing usage and experimentation to even discover the value of these technologies, right? What it is good for, what it is not good for. So we basically track, is there substantial variation in usage across the paralegals who are the main users of this technology across this division A and B. And we did find quite substantial difference. So in terms of just raw usage, we found the paralegals in division A using it a lot more, 58% more. But more than that usage, we found experimentation was quite important, right? We found the paralegals in Division A were experimenting with the technology a lot more, right? A lot more than the paralegals in the other division. And we were like, what is going on? Why do we see this? And by experimentation here, I mean they were using a lot more, discovering a lot more features and functionalities that even the designers of this technology didn't envision. For instance, some of the paralegals were using this LawBot to basically do case analysis, to look at prior case histories and stuff like that, to do legal research. And that was not originally this technology was designed for. This technology was mainly designed to create contracts and NDAs faster. It would combine different legal clauses and create a complex contract or a non-disclosure agreement much faster. That was the original use case. But through experimentation, the paralegals in Division A found that no, we can actually use it for other things, for legal research, for many other purposes than just creating contracts and NDAs. So that was great, right? But that was not happening so much in Division B. The paralegals were actually not experimenting or discovering new use cases for this technology, right? Finally, there's also less knowledge sharing among the paralegals in Division B as compared to Division A. For instance, the paralegals would say, if I did this type of prompting, it is not working quite well, it is hallucinating, and they were trying to reverse engineer why it is happening, what type of prompts to avoid, what type of chain of thought prompts that they should give, stuff like that. A lot more of that happening in Division A versus Division B, right? So that was a basic finding that we started with. Why do we see substantive variation in both usage but more importantly, in experimentation and knowledge sharing, which has some implications of what kind of skills the paralegals developed in the process, which I'll get to, right? But I want to ask you, think for a few minutes on why this is happening, right? Why do we see the substantive variation? What do you think is some of the causes are? Again, use the Q&A. Why do you see that division A, the paralegals are using it, experimenting a lot more, sharing their knowledge with each other as compared to the paralegals in division B? Again, use the Q&A to jot down any thought that comes to your mind. Do you think it's because the incentives are different? Do you think it's because the culture is different? Whatever comes to your mind, please put them in the Q&A, and then we can have a conversation about it. Yeah. So do you think that the paralegals in Division A are trained differently, or think about what are the potential reasons, and then I'll talk about what are the actual reasons on why we see the substantive variation, right? Competition, some psychological safety to experiment, that's great. That's one of the reasons, definitely. Fear of losing skills, job by technology, great. But again, ask why is it that one set of paralegals might have had that fear over the other set? It's again the same company, they are paid same, the incentives are the same, the culture is also more or less the same too. So ask about why, what is causing this, right? Staff in Division A is younger, not necessarily. We looked at the age and the experience levels of the paralegals across the divisions are more or less the same, right? Leadership difference, great, but if you could be a bit more specific on what that would entail, right? So these are all great answers, right? So let me briefly walk through what happened, right? Let's start with the division where things were not going great, right? The division B where there was less usage, basically less experimentation, less knowledge sharing. What happened was the division, again, remember this organization chose to use a very decentralized model to introduce and scale up Gen AI, right? So the division managers had a lot of discretion and leeway on how they went about positioning this technology and introducing it, what sort of incentives and other things they had in place. So the managers in Division B, they introduced this technology as like a generic productivity improvement tool, right? That's the framing they used when they introduced it in the meetings and the emails they sent out saying, use this lawbot, this Gen AI technology to do your contracts and NDAs faster. So that's the framing, that's the positioning they use, a productivity enhancement tool. Very less focus on skills or skill development or job enrichment. Essentially, like what is in it for the paralegals if they are a lot more productive, right? Very less focus on that, right? And also the lack of credible commitment from the managers on what opportunities for the paralegals, what do they have to perform new tasks and new skills, right? So this was the starting point, which created a set of dynamics that we tracked through interviews, observations, and some experiments we did. So because the managers in this division said this lawbot could be viewed as a productivity improvement tool, the paralegals actually asked the question, okay, what if we are more productive today? And what if we are more productive 2 months from now? What is going to happen to us, both individually, but also as a group, say 6 months or 1 year or 2 years from now? Just because we are more productive, are we shooting ourselves on the foot and replacing ourselves in the process? And so they viewed Lawbot, this Gen AI technology, as a threat that devalues their expertise. It might be great in improving their productivity, but it is not doing anything for them, right? What is in it for them in terms of new skill development or basically some signal about career mobility, right? So that was clearly lacking. So that created some kind of a vicious cycle. The paralegals first thought of this technology as a threat to their expertise that devalues their expertise. And sometimes they even worried they might get consolidated into some kind of a shared service. They lose power in the process, right? Which in turn led to lack of trust in the technology itself. But it is not that they were not using it. They were still trying to use it here and there. But the minute they used it and they found some problems, right? If the technology throws up a wrong legal clause or if it hallucinates and makes up a clause that doesn't even exist, they anchored and overemphasized on those negative experiences, saying see, like, I can't trust this technology because it is just like throwing up some garbage, right? They anchored around that instead of trying to experiment and work around and see what it is good for. And because they anchored around those negative experiences, it led to further lack of trust, further lack of usage and experimentation. So that led to this like vicious cycle. So not only they were able to discover new use cases, but they were not also able to do new tasks and expand their jurisdiction, as opposed to the paralegals and the other division that we'll talk about. And in the process, there was very less opportunities for them to learn new skills. So therefore, they thought the technology is not really helping them anyway, right? So that's what happened. Paralegals in this division, as one of them said, I don't like LawBot. I don't find it useful. It's a pain. It has a lot of issues. And we, the paralegals in Division B, don't trust it enough to use it every day, right? So there's one thing that I want to highlight, right? This paradox, like you will trust it if you use it more and experiment and try to understand its strengths and limitations, but you will not do it if you find it almost feel threatened by experimenting, right? So that's what happened in this division. There's this psychologically, they felt unsafe to experiment, but also they felt there's very less in it for them in terms of learning new skills and career mobility through using this technology. Rather, they felt it's almost like a threat to their expertise. So that's what happened in Division B. Let's get to what happened in Division A. And again, these two divisions are in different buildings, right? So we didn't observe the paralegals talking to each other that much. So maybe if they did, that could have changed the dynamics. I'm not sure. But what happened in Division A? Here again, the managers of this division had a lot of discretion on how to introduce this technology, right? So here, the managers, again, happenstance, they did not plan explicitly on how to introduce it, but the way they positioned this technology was less of a productivity improvement tool. They did not use things such as, oh, you just use it to do your contracts and NDAs faster, but rather they use more of a skill development type of framing. Use this technology to, one, do the tasks that you always wanted to do, complex tasks, make room to do those tasks faster. So that skill development or job enrichment type of framing had a lot of positive downstream effects, which we'll talk about, right? So what happened first? The way they framed it was, as I said, first they said, what else do you want to be involved in as a paralegal? What are the tasks or activities that you wanted to do? Could you find this slack time to do that in addition to what you're already doing? So the paralegals in this organization, a lot of their time goes in creating these complex contracts and NDAs, but a lot of them also actually hated doing those tasks. They felt that that is not what really they are trained for or capable of. They could do a lot more complex tasks, such as legal research and stuff like that. So therefore, these managers also said, maybe start using this technology, this LawBot, to do the tasks that you hate to do faster, right? Do the contracts and NDAs faster. But that's not all there is to it, right? You do it faster so that you could do other more complex tasks that you always wanted to do, loved to do, because you're learning new things in the process, right? So let me walk through what that specifically meant. What that meant was that the paralegals like to do legal research. They wanted to be part of the legal strategy meetings and help out the attorneys, right? But they never had the time to do it because most of their time went in creating these complex contracts and NDAs. So this positioning was essentially saying, use the LawBot to basically do that boring tasks or tasks that you had to do faster, so that, and this is the important part, so that you could do more complex tasks that you like to do, and in the process you develop new skills, right? So that created a lot of positive spillovers, which we will briefly talk about, right? But in addition to that, these managers also, they credibly committed on their promise, right? They said that use this tool to do more complex tasks that you always wanted and loved to do, like legal research. So to do that, they gave slack time, right? To explore this tool, to basically use the LawBot, experiment with it, have these knowledge sharing sessions. They gave training and mentorship. They basically matched like a senior paralegal with a junior, and it's actually the junior paralegals taught the seniors on how to use these the LawBot better, right? They did a lot of other things beyond just saying use the technology. that in turn facilitated a more positive or a virtuous cycle, right? Again, here too, it's not that the paralegals initially, when the managers introduced the technology, that they were all very kumbaya about this. They were not all like super enthusiastic. They were initially quite skeptical, saying, okay, yet another technology that we should use. So they were quite skeptical initially. But this framing around you are able to learn new skills, do more complex tasks in the process, in addition to a bunch of other things, the continued commitment towards training and mentorship and basically learning more complex tasks and skills, that motivated them to at least try out the technology, right? So as you see in this figure, they took this leap of faith to experiment and use Gen AI. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it did not. So they had both negative, positive, and some ambivalent experiences. But because they felt that there's something in it for them in terms of learning new skills and doing more complex tasks, they persisted with it. They did more, continued to use and experiment and share their knowledge with each other. What is working, what is not, what prompts to use, what to avoid, stuff like that. And in that process, they were able to understand the strengths of the technology also better, right? Which led to more usage, more experimentation, more knowledge sharing. And even more importantly, through this process, they not only learned about the technology better, right? What it is good for, not good for, what to avoid, but also they were able to do more complex tasks that they didn't do. As I said, legal research, being part of client strategy meetings, taking notes, and a bunch of other things that they were not doing before. And this process together, using the technology to do more complex tasks, and in the process of doing complex tasks, you learn the technology better, right? That cycle is the main thing that I wanted to communicate, right? That's the way that people learn new skills and also learn to use the technology, Gen AI, much better in the process, because it is based on not some hypothetical task, but actual tasks that they do as a part of their everyday work, right? So this division, as you could see, the paralegals were like, I wanted to find out what tasks I could do faster. We paralegals hate doing NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, and contracts, but most of us like doing legal research, and we would love to be part of the legal strategy meetings, or at least observe them. So if I could identify how to do NDAs and contracts faster using the law bot, perhaps I could then lobby my manager to include me in meetings and client interfacing and doing legal research and all other complex tasks that they wanted to do, right? So that's the first set of findings, right? So where you see one set of paralegals able to learn new skills in the process of using the technology and performing more complex tasks. But that's not the end of the story, right? There is like a positive spillover that happened because the paralegals in this division were able to do more complex tasks. It had a spillover to other types of roles, right? Like the legal secretaries or admin assistants started doing a bit more complex tasks in the process than what they used to do. Likewise, the clerks and the summer attorneys started doing more complex tasks using this technology, and in the process, learning the technology better, but also performing more additional tasks and learning new skills in the process, right? So that's a positive part, but that's not the end of the story, right? Here is where the power and politics comes into the picture, right? Now the paralegals are doing a lot more complex tasks like legal research, interfacing with clients, being part of legal strategy meetings, at least like, being on the background, taking notes and stuff like that. But the junior attorneys in this division, Division A, and these are your second year, third year associates straight out of law school, right? They felt threatened by the paralegals being part of doing all this legal research and stuff, right? So they were pushing back, saying, that's my turf. Don't intrude my turf, almost, right? So the paralegals, this is a junior attorney saying the paralegals are not trained to do these things, such as legal research. If they do all of these things, but screw up their main task and make mistakes that the client catches at the end of the day, that would be embarrassing for all of us, blah, 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 right? So essentially, they're saying that stick to your lane, don't come to don't sort of intrude my turf. Which, if you think about it, it's not a very productive way, right? It's not that the junior attorneys have only certain types of tasks to do. It's not a zero-sum game. They could do a lot more complex tasks than doing basic legal research, right? So therefore here, this is what we call a lump of task fallacy. It's almost a zero-sum mindset where people think that these are the tasks that we have under our jurisdiction and nobody else should come and do it. And in the process, they are limited in what type of skills they develop and so forth, right? So as a manager, they have to basically get rid of this lump of task fallacy. They have to intervene, and the managers of this division intervene to actually redesign the role of the junior attorneys, saying you could also use the law bar to do other more complex legal research or other things like that you're not doing, and in the process learn the technology, but also learn new skills and perform new tasks. So they had to redesign the role of the junior attorney too in the process, right? So the upshot here with this is that basically the junior attorneys in this organization thought, these are all the tasks that they could do, but you have to redesign the role of multiple people in the organization if at all you're going to derive some value from technology such as Gen AI. If you only focused on the paralegals and ignored the others, you're going to get some pushback from more senior roles such as the attorneys. So if you're a manager, think not just about redesigning one role at a time, but think about map multiple roles and what the dependencies are, and try to redesign multiple of them by giving them opportunities to learn new skills to perform more complex tasks. And in the process, you would see a more positive spillover. So the final thing that happened here in this organization is, now that the paralegals are doing a lot of legal related stuff like legal research, but also some business development related activities like interfacing with clients, being part of client meetings, right? They now had to report to two different bosses, one to the legal function, the attorneys, but also to the account managers who are part of the business development, right? So therefore, there are a lot of other questions on how should the paralegals be evaluated for their performance review at the end of the year. How should they manage the workload? Is it going to be more 70-30, 60-40? So basically, the organizational structure, the reporting structure too, have to be rethought, in part because people are using this technology and developing new skills in the process, right? So therefore, the broader message I wanted to leave is that we have to think more organizationally if you're thinking about using Gen AI to learn new skills. It is not just about one individual. You have to rethink the whole organizational structure as a system. And only then we would see positive impact in terms of both productivity gains, but also more importantly, in terms of skills and skill development. So that's basically the broader takeaway is, one, the role of experimentation. That's super important, especially in the case of Gen AI. And you have to facilitate a culture of experimentation. Only then you would see what this technology could be good for. And the way to do it is to incentivize people, saying you are able to learn new skills and perform more complex tasks in the process. If we just use the language around productivity, perhaps that is not going to take you far, right? People interpret productivity and productivity improvement in very different ways, sometimes in negative ways, thinking of them as almost like a threat to their job, rather using it as like a part of skill development, and basically continue your commitment towards that as a manager, like providing opportunities to learn new skills. That is always super helpful and important to leverage the benefits of this technology. And finally, you have to think about not just redesigning one role, the targeted user of Gen AI, but multiple roles in the organization together to avoid all this tough battles or jurisdictional struggles. So that's going to be important. And finally, how do you measure impact? If you are a manager, the question always on how do you measure impact? You could easily measure productivity, but here, as I showed, that's not enough. You have to show what new tasks that people did that they never did before. That could be one way to measure impact, right? So the Division A paralegals, they were now able to take on a lot more clients. They were taking on different types of clients that they did before. So all of this I view as part of measuring impact, right? Doing new tasks, complex tasks, doing new types of activities, they are all important. So therefore, the broader message there is move beyond just measures of productivity and ROI. Think in terms of skills and skill-first organization, what type of skills you inculcate in your people, which obviously is going to produce more positive downstream impact, right? So those are the main things I want to talk about. I'll skip this. Basically, a lot of things that you already covered. The psychological safety is important. Many things you put in the chat. But I wanted to leave with some open time for questions and Q&A, anything that I covered in the presentation, but also any other general questions you have about AI and skill development. Happy to take them now. Again, use the Q&A function, and Heidi would sort of sort through the questions.
Arvind, thank you for this informative presentation. We've had several questions come in throughout your talk, and I'd like to just remind our audience today that you can still have some time to submit your questions in, but yeah, let's dive in. So one question that came in was, with the pace of advances in Gen AI, do we have time to work through these power and political issues before the next wave of advances hit? How do we reconcile the fast pace of AI advances with the slower pace of organizational change?
Yeah, great question. Which is why I think this inculcating a broader mindset in people, saying that the task that you're doing today is not the be it and end it all of you could do other more complex tasks using this technology. So that in itself would be a starting point to avoid all this power political turf wars, right? Saying, don't think of the lump of task fallacy I talked about, right? Just emphasizing that, saying, we are fundamentally going to rethink each of your role, given this technology, given what it is capable of, and therefore being a lot more flexible and agile with that is going to be helpful, right? I think that would be a starting point. Yeah, I would sort of start there, as emphasizing to people, more senior people too, saying that whatever tasks and work activities you're doing, that is not what you're going to do, maybe even 6 months from now, setting those expectations ahead of time and reinforcing that as a manager, that is going to help. That goes a long way.
Thank you. We have some questions that were specific to the case study, so I'll try to kind of lump some of those together. We had some questions about what generation of Gen AI did this study cover, and some questions asking for clarification about sort of the managers in these different divisions. What were some of their different attitudes, and why did management in Division B fail to commit to using AI? So
great. Yeah. So the generation, as I said, it's a vertical specific LLM. So the 2022. So whatever the latest version, latest generation of Gen AI, that's the one that they use. It's not ChaptGPT. It is not. So in that sense, the technology itself, it's very specific to the legal industry and what their use cases are, right? So that's with the technology question. The Division B, the managers, it's not that they were averse to using the technology. They just thought it is just merely a productivity improvement tool, right? And they emphasize that, thinking, if you incentivize people or frame this as productivity improvement tool, people would be a lot more motivated to use it. But as we saw, that's not what happened, right? So that's one. And second, they were a little reluctant to give slack time to employees to experiment. They thought, oh, why should we do it? Why should we allow people, give them an hour every week to experiment? We could basically use that 1 hour better to serve our clients' needs. But they didn't realize that the value one creates from these technologies through experimentation. You have to facilitate a culture of experimentation where people learn what it is good for their work. You cannot do it as a manager sitting at a distance, right? So those two things, I would say, some commitment to training and mentorship and slack time for experimentation, as opposed to viewing it strictly through like an optimization lens, like every last second or minute of the employee's time, I want to make sure that they are billable. So I think those two are super important. Like not having that mindset is going to be super important.
Thank you. Another question that came in said, first off, thank you so much for an insightful and practical presentation in deploying AI in organizations. What are your thoughts on implementing hybrid functional and decentralized organizational design to make best use of both, the benefits of both?
Yeah, I think like what we are seeing, we are studying other organizations too. So more of a network of excellence model, like center of excellence model, is working great, right? It's almost like a hub and spoke type of model, where you have a set of experts in this technology, a lot of them quite young too, and they go around spreading the best practices and creating this culture of experimentation across the organization is working. But of course, in terms of resources, a functional model might work better because there's someone who's accountable for doing this initiative and scaling it across, especially if you're a large organization. But I would sort of sequence this, right? Sequence it, right? Maybe start with more of a hub and spoke model. And then once you realize you have enough critical mass and you want to standardize some of the practices, once you understood what people are using it for, then perhaps having like an AI, Gen AI sort of function might be helpful. But I would always start with more a decentralized or a network model first to understand what different employees in your company even find it useful, valuable, and then sort of take it from there.
Okay,
Right.
we still have time for a few more questions. A
Sure.
question about psychological safety. Can you
Yeah.
expand on this? What is it? Why is it important? And who should take the
Yes.
lead when behaviors and attitudes are not well managed?
Yes, great. So the idea of psychological safety is super important in this context, right? Because the basic idea is psychological safety is a group level construct. Basically, it suggests that the organization, the employees interpret the organization having certain level of tolerance for mistakes, for experimentation, and that is especially important in the case of Gen AI, right? As I mentioned, there are no pre-built features and functionalities per se like other technologies. They get discovered as people use it every day as a part of their work. But why would they experiment if they are always threatened that if I make a mistake, I'm going to get penalized for that? Or if I sort of just like, work around the technology, my manager or my peer might view that I'm wasting my time, right? So those all create a very psychologically unsafe climate for people to experiment. So that's one. The second importance of psychological safety is you are also not always under the threat of, oh, man, am I going to get replaced or lose power in the process, right? So that's also where psychological safety is going to be important. Some kind of assurance that you're free to experiment and expand your portfolio of work, your jurisdiction, and in the process, you're not going to be penalized for that. In fact, you might get rewarded for that. uh, Getting that message across is going to be very important, especially in this case of Gen AI.
Thank you. We've had some questions, I think, that are maybe industry specific, that maybe kind of come back to a question of what can Gen AI, do, and what job functions might be most susceptible to AI-enabled augmentation. Are there certain characteristics of a
Yeah.
job or certain industries that you think are most impacted in the present moment?
Yeah, I mean, there's like a new paper that just came out. A bunch of people from Wharton and OpenAI. The basic thrust of their argument is a lot of industries that is very text heavy, right? Text and images heavy. They would be most susceptible. Obviously, like we know, like call centers and help desk, those functions are already been impacted. Legal industry is impacted a lot. So even ad agencies, we are seeing quite a bit of impact, especially on the more basic functions like creating a banner and stuff like that, right? So those would be the industries. I would encourage you to look at that paper where they have a more detailed table on both the industries but also the occupations that would be the most susceptible. I can share the link in the Q&A box. Yeah.
Great. We'll
Yeah.
take
Other
just one
questions or?
more. I think we'll take probably, we've got so many questions, and we're not going to be able to get to all of them today. This has been a great
No worries. Yeah.
conversation. I think we'll probably take just one last one here.
Sure. Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
um, question about how do you see Gen AI within learning and development within an organization?
Oh yeah, that's like a huge question. People are
Yes.
rethinking learning. Sorry, yeah, people are rethinking how we should think about workforce training and skill development with the in the wake of Gen AI. Before, like a lot of the best practices were, oh, we had to send employees for training and they had to watch like otherwise like some videos. But we know like that's not great at developing new skills or even retention. So what people are finding is actually using Gen AI and creating very task or activity specific bots, right? So there's a bot for negotiation if your job involves a lot of negotiation with people, and using it to train people on how to use Gen AI, but also performing the task better. So that's the direction that we are seeing. A lot of companies trying to develop very task-specific bots, Gen AI-enabled ones, and asking people to use it as a part of their everyday work. And there are bots for different purposes. Negotiation bot. There is one for supply chain optimization, stuff like that. Like we're seeing a lot more usage. People are using it. They're retaining what the technology is good for.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to answer our audience's questions today. And Arvind, just for your presentation. It was wonderful. If you liked Arvind's presentation today on AI in the workplace and skill development, then you might want to check out his course, Change Management, Reskilling in the Age of AI and Analytics. Or the program that course sits under, which is the Stanford Online Digital Transformation Program. Links to both of those things are included in your dashboard today for the webinar. If you're interested in more topics on AI, we've also included a link to the new Stanford Online Generative AI Technology, Business, and Society program. So check those out if you're interested. I want to thank everyone who's stayed online for the duration of the webinar today. I hope you have a great day, and thank you for joining us.